Japan currently is a cheap country from a British or American point of view as a visitor. A bargain, Japan really is, thanks to the weak yen. I think that 2024 might see that change as the turnaround happens in Japanese interest rates, and perhaps you see wage inflation happening as well. And the strong yen could then be the story of the year from a market's point of view.
So, Bill Emmott-san, welcome to our show. Welcome to Pivot.
It's a delight to be with you again.
Thank you. So today's topic will be about 10 big risks for 2024. And you were the editor-in-chief of The Economist for 13 years, and you have written many books on Japan. And especially you're famous for predicting the burst of Japanese economy. So you kindly created us a list, 10 global risks for 2024. So overall, was it difficult to create a list, or was there no room for discussion?
I think that with this kind of exercise, it's easy to come up with the top 4 or 5 big risks. It's harder to think about 10. And the reason for that is to do with the concept of risk. Of course, in any year, all sorts of things could happen. All sorts of things could go wrong.
Yes.
And many of them are actually unforeseeable risks. You know, we didn't know in 2020 there was going to be a global pandemic. So if you interviewed me on January or December 2019 and said, what are the big risks for 2020? I would not have said, oh, a global pandemic. But of course, there are all sorts of theoretical risks that we could list. And so then the question when you think about a list like this is, should you include theoretical risks like a pandemic? Or should you, or a tsunami or a nuclear accident or something? But more practically, I think you kind of focus on some of the things you know, what the former US Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, called known unknowns, things you know about that might happen. And if they go one way, it could have a big impact. So that's what I focused on. And it's easy to come up with 5. It's harder to think it through to around 9 or 10 in my experience.
Thank you. So we'll go over the 10 lists. So overall, for Japan, what kind of year will 2024 will be? Will it be a positive year or negative year, or what's your opinion?
I think that for Japan, I don't see any big dramatic change in the economy coming in Japan. But I think it will be a year of some political uncertainty about the future of the Kishida administration, about the credibility and legitimacy of his government and of the major forces in the Liberal Democratic Party. Secondly, it will be a year of uncertainty and worry because of the outside world, particularly the top 2 risks that I list in my own list. Number 1, United States, obviously Japan's closest ally and partner. What's going to happen in the election in November? Will Donald Trump be reelected? And secondly, the situation around Taiwan, which is, of course, of critical importance to Japan. And with an election in Taiwan on January the 13th, and with the relatively pro-independence candidate currently tipped to win, although it's uncertain, Japan's worry should be that there could be increased military tensions around Taiwan and increased pressure from Chinese military on Taiwan, which then has a knock-on effect on Japan. So those are the major things that I can think of that are known knowns about, or known unknowns about the future of Japan in 2024.
Interesting. So I have the list on the screen for our Pivot audience. So let's go one by one. So number 1, you mentioned re-election of Donald Trump as US president. And I'm surprised that when I look at the polls, there's some certain possibility of Donald Trump winning again. What's your opinion? What's your view so far?
Well, my view is that actually he's not likely to win, but the risk that he does win is a high impact risk, because I think if he were to be elected president again, 4 years after contesting the previous election, 4 years after an attempted insurrection in Washington on Capitol Hill by his supporters, induced by him, in a year in which he's been in a whole series of legal cases challenging his position, some of which may be resolved before then, I think it would lead to a crisis in American democracy and in the rule of law in the United States if he were to be re-elected. It would be a crisis partly because of what he would do. He will enact revenge, and I think he will try to behave as much like a dictator, as much like Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping as he can. But secondly, it will cause something that we might even predict could be almost a civil war in the United States, because the opponents of Donald Trump will feel that they have to fight against him in the same way that his supporters fought against the 2020 election. So I think that there could be violence, there could be very serious demonstrations in a lot of American cities. So it's a high impact event. Am I predicting it? No. One, because there's still almost 12 months to go, and opinion polls are quite meaningless at this stage in the experience of the American electorate. There's a lot of uncertainties between now and then, and I think the advantages of the incumbent Joe Biden or of his party, the Democrats, are strong. So the likelihood is that it won't happen, but the impact, if it does happen, could be very, very significant.
So before talking about the impact of Donald Trump becoming president again, I want to talk about Joe Biden. So I agree he has still support from the American public, but at the same time, he's kind of losing trust and people are worried about his age. How do you see Joe Biden's possibility of becoming the next president or for the next election?
Well, I think that clearly people are worried about his age. He's 81. Donald Trump is 77.
Yeah.
Which of them is in better health? It's not clear. Which of them is in better mental health? Also not clear. So I think it's a terrible situation. I think that Biden, his record is actually pretty good. And I think that as we get closer to the election, he should have more success in convincing voters of the nature of his record, particularly where manufacturing is important, where previously job losses were important, because employment creation has been incredibly strong. And so his chances in Pennsylvania and Michigan, in these kind of states, which are critical to the Electoral College, actually are probably better than the polls currently suggest. So I think he has a better chance than it appears. I also think that we should expect that there will be points when it's possible he might withdraw, and we might find even Donald Trump declining in the Republican polls, and maybe there's a possibility that the election unexpectedly will be between Nikki Haley on the Republican side and Gretchen Whitmer or Gavin Newsom on the Democrat side. I don't think it's a completely done deal that says these are the two candidates. So there's a lot to play for. But the outlier, the extreme case, would be the re-election of a man who has explicitly rejected the validity of the previous election and who is on trial for his efforts to overturn the constitutional status of that election. So it's a pretty serious issue.
Right. So on the list, you mentioned about Russian-Ukraine war for number 3 and the Israel-Hamas war widening for number 4. So if Donald Trump will be re-elected, what will happen to the war in Russia and Israel?
Well, I think the war in Russia, clearly everything depends on how things look in that war in 12 months' time, or in fact 13 months' time, because he would not be in in office until the end of January 2025. But and it's quite hard to predict how the war will look in 12 months' time. I think that his instinct would be to support Israel and take on Iran in a widening war. So I think his election could actually fuel a widening war if that war is still going on in 12 months' time in the Middle East. On the other hand, I think his instinct will be to try to basically betray Ukraine and do some kind of a deal with Vladimir Putin that cedes territory to Russia. But everything depends on what the situation is in 12 months' time and how much support the US and Europe in particular have been able to give to Ukraine, military support, financial support, during 2024. So it's hard to predict what his effect would be on an unknown situation in 12 months' time. And the reason I include the Russia-Ukraine war on this list of risks is because I think that while it looks currently like a kind of stalemate with not too much movement between the two sides, actually, I think from a world point of view, we need to see this as an unstable situation because wars are always potentially unstable. And it's an unstable situation that could move rapidly and strongly in one direction or the other. Risk number 3 on mine is that Russia prevails or Russia succeeds. And that's quite a disaster for liberal democracies. It will strengthen China and its resolve over Taiwan. It will put in danger other neighboring countries in Europe. I think that a Russian success in Ukraine would be a destabilizing one. But on the other hand, lower down in my list, number 9, I included the opposite outcome. An outcome in the war which led to instability in Russia itself, perhaps a coup d'etat or a coup attempt, perhaps a civil war in Russia, the fall of the Putin regime. We saw in 2023 that there were attempts, there was a threat by his mercenary ally, Prigozhin. I think that could happen again if the war went in Ukraine's favor in a quite decisive way at any stage during the year. That could lead to political instability in Russia, which would also be destabilizing. So in thinking of risks in the world, you have to think about the uncertainties that they that they give rise to politically and economically.
So do you think Putin is waiting for the result of the election because, it seems stable in a way, and there are reports that Ukrainian soldiers are becoming very tired, and some U.S. politicians are becoming to question the support for Ukraine. Do you think Putin's kind of waiting for the results, or it's hard to say, but expecting Donald Trump to win?
I think that if you are a Ukrainian living in either the areas of the conflict or in Kiev or Odessa, the major cities, you don't think that Russia is waiting for anything because you are under regular attack by Russian missiles, by Russian drones. And actually your worry currently is that Russia is building its ammunition and its missile stocks faster than you are. Because the supply of Western missiles and ammunition has slowed down to Ukraine. And on the other hand, Russia has been buying weapons from North Korea and Iran and has increased its own production. So that if you're in Ukraine, you don't feel that Putin's waiting at all.
That's right.
You feel threatened by the military efforts that Putin is making towards you. And probably you feel a sense of urgency to try to cut that off by, in particular, threatening his supply lines into Crimea yourself. So I think there's something misleading about the idea of a stalemate or of Putin waiting for anything. I definitely think Putin would anticipate that if Trump is elected, he has a chance then to turn America against his enemy, Ukraine. But he is not going to wait for the next 11 months in any sense. He's fighting a war, and he's mobilizing a few thousand every day. On some days, he's using a lot of weapons. So I think it's misleading to think of him as waiting. There's no doubt that he will prefer a Trump re-election because it weakens America, it weakens the West in general, and it weakens Ukraine. But he's not waiting for it.
You're right. I shouldn't have not used the word waiting, but I think you're absolutely right that from Ukrainians' point of view, they're at war and they're threatened. So let's go to list number 2, the Chinese military pressure on newly elected pro-independence Taiwan president. And the election is about to take place in less than 1 month, January 13th. So what will be the results and effect of the Taiwan election?
Well, the Taiwan election it's good. It looks pretty close in the opinion polls.
Yes.
So it's not a sure thing who's going to win, but it's clear that the contest from a geopolitical point of view is between a relatively pro-China two candidates, the Kuomintang candidate and so-called Taiwan People's Party candidate who failed to achieve an agreement to run on a coalition ticket, which has weakened them. But still, the Taiwan People's Party candidate is very close in the polls to his opponent, the Democratic People's Party candidate. From a Chinese point of view, either of those two opposition candidates would lead to them thinking that there was an opportunity for dialogue that could lead to either a reducing of tensions or even ultimately to negotiations about reunification from a Chinese point of view. Whereas if the current vice president, Lai Ching-te, known as William Lai to his Western friends, if he is elected, the same party therefore continuing as president, then he is known to be much more pro-independence. And I think from a risk point of view, from the outside world, the risk candidate is clearly the relatively pro-independence candidate, because I think it's clear that China will be determined to put pressure on him during his early months as president to basically, from their point of view, show him who's boss. There will be military exercises, there will be incursions into Taiwanese airspace, there will be intimidation of many kinds in order to intimidate him and discourage him from taking any pro-independence position, but also to test out his resolve, but also the resolve of his allies, which are the United States critically and Japan, and to test the reactions. So I'm not predicting an invasion. I'm not predicting an actual conflict, but I think that the tensions will escalate during 2024 if he is elected president.
Right. And which will affect Japanese policies a lot. And I remember President Obama using the word pivot, and the U.S. foreign policy was aimed to pivoting to Asia. But now we have the war in Ukraine, Russia, and Israel and Hamas. And if Donald Trump will be reelected, it will be unlikely to think that the U.S. will, do you think that U.S. will lose interest or not pay attention to Chinese Taiwan issues? Or what do you think about that?
No, I think that whoever is elected in November next year in the U.S., I think that the focus on China and the focus on treating China as an adversary, both economically and specifically over Taiwan, I think that'll continue and it will be strong, whoever wins. Yes, Trump is unpredictable. Trump likes to think that he can do deals with other dictators. But actually the strong bias in his previous administration, but also in his party, is a strongly anti-China bias.
Yes.
A confrontational approach to China. So I don't think that that aspect of American foreign policy is likely to change, depending on the election. I guess the big question is how cooperative a Trump administration will be with its allies, Japan, Korea, Australia, the Philippines, and European allies in Asia. Trump was famously not very cooperative.
Right.
But I think that probably that's manageable from a Japanese point of view, or a Filipino point of view, or an Australian point of view, in a way that the issue over Ukraine would be much less manageable.
So President Trump used to, like you mentioned, think that he can do like one-to-one, face-to-face deal with dictators and all the other leaders in the world, and leave out the allies. But at that time, there was Prime Minister Abe, after President Trump was elected, he flew to US. And there's no Prime Minister Abe anymore. So how can Japan, if President Trump will be elected, keep being allied with the United States?
Well, I think that Japan has no choice. So the first decision would be to work with the administration, whoever is elected. Japan has no other choice.
Right.
But I think the second part of it would be to double down on the kind of investment in your relative independence through your own defense build-up plan, through your other relationships, including with the UK and others over defense and defense investment. I think that it would accelerate Japan's awareness that it needed to be more self-sufficient on defense. But Japan's realistic about this. You know full well that you cannot quickly, or even perhaps ever, be totally self-sufficient. So I think that there's no way that you would break with the US. But clearly, and you don't have someone of the stature of Prime Minister Abe, who would be there to go and persuade and negotiate with a new president. That's true. Prime Minister Abe had the great advantage that he was already very experienced in office by the time of 2016, and very well reputed in foreign affairs, whereas either Prime Minister Kishida or his successor are not in that same, don't have that same status. I think that's true. But still, the basic direction of Japanese foreign policy would not change, which has been a direction of increased self-sufficiency and strengthening ties with other allies, like the joint fighter project with the UK and Italy. I think you definitely be working even more on those kind of projects.
Right. Let's talk about China, because you mentioned on number 6 about the Chinese economy slowing by more than expected. What's your take on the Chinese economy? What's the status like?
Well, I think that a lot of people talk about the Japanification of China, and I think that it is to some degree instructive to think back to the Japanese economy in the early 1990s. In 1990, 1991, 1992.
Is that the time you were in Japan?
It was the time when I'd published my book,
yes.
called The Sun Also Sets, Hiwa Mata Shizumu. And of course, Japan had suffered a big financial crash in the stock and property markets. There was clearly a big problem of debt, corporate debt especially, and the banks. But there was a kind of period in which growth was not very affected. So there was a sort of phony period where it looked like maybe it was manageable. And then it was really only in 93, 4, 5 that the harsh reality of what had happened really came home was unavoidable. And I feel that China is in a bit of a similar position. It has a huge debt overhang, a huge problem of debt and essentially a collapse in the property market. Its financial system is different from Japan's, and therefore the state of the banks is more a problem for the public finances than it is for the markets. But still, you don't avoid losses on bank loans when a property crash happens. So I think that what we will see in China is actually a delayed effect of this collapse in the property market and a delayed and a slow erosion of Chinese strength and economic growth, thanks to the weakening of the banking system and the effect on the public finances. So I would suspect that, things might look okay this year, they might look okay early next year, but actually as the year goes on, we're going to see China looking weaker and weaker because it can't avoid the reality of what's happened in the property market. And it doesn't have an easy policy solution to it. So I do think that an important risk for the world is not a collapse, but a much weaker Chinese economy, which is important for anyone exporting to China, including obviously Japanese companies. It also leads to some questions about political and social stability in China.
Right.
Again, maybe they're different from in some other countries, thanks to the nature of the communist regime. But nevertheless, even China is not immune to the social consequences of an economic crisis. So I think we should imagine a weaker China and a China that has some risks to its political stability in the next several years.
How about the unemployment rate, especially among the young generation?
They're building an alienated generation. Now, that happened in Japan in the 1990s, the so-called Ice Age generation.
Yes.
In Japan, it did not cause social instability, but it had its long-term social and economic effects. I think that we should expect that it will have some effects in China, which probably is really about instability inside the leadership, inside the Communist Party, as consciousness rises of declining legitimacy and popularity of the communist leadership. But it could produce some effects on the streets of some cities, just as there were protests against the COVID restrictions a year ago, and that produced a very quick policy change by Xi Jinping, by the president. So I do think that Chinese social instability will be a factor, thanks to the alienation of the younger generation.
How about U.S.-China relations, especially after Xi Jinping visited the U.S.? And I was talking to one Japanese scholar in Japan specializing in Chinese politics, and she noticed some kind of a positive impact after the visit. Do you see any change after his visit to the United States?
So I think that the fact that the visit happened and the atmosphere of the meeting reflected the fact that China does not feel in a strong position. It has a weakening economy. It does not see an opportunity to exploit the geopolitical tension and crises happening in Israel and Hamas or the Russia-Ukraine war. And so it doesn't want to have a confrontational relationship with the United States. Our question is whether this will continue. And I think it will during 2024, in the pre-election period for the US and with economic slowdown in China. Of course, the Taiwan question that we discussed earlier could be a factor also in US-China relations. That's the major uncertainty. But otherwise, I think we're entering a period of relative quiet and calm in US-China relations, basically because both sides actually look weak.
Okay, to wrap up, so a lot of our audience, PIVOT audience, are interested in inflation and what will happen to the world and Japanese economy in 2024. On your list, you mentioned energy and commodity price spike for number 5, and number 10, you mentioned about the revival of inflation in US and Europe. Could you walk us through the impact of inflation and also the energy and commodity prices?
I think that in terms of risk, we need to think about inflation and energy especially as a consequence of other political risks. So if the Israel-Hamas war widens, particularly to include Iran, which controls a crucial waterway that is a sea lane for oil exports, including to Japan, if that widened, or if the Russia-Ukraine war worsened in a serious way, or if the Taiwan tensions really accelerated, you could then get an energy price and commodity price spike, which then leads to a revival of inflation. So it's a consequence of other political risks, but then leads to a problem of economic management. And if the current market expectations, which is in the US and Europe that interest rates have peaked and are now going to decline, therefore financial players are positioning themselves on that expectation. If that suddenly changed for political reasons, you could then get financial instability with banks going bust like the Silicon Valley Bank did on the previous turn in interest rates. That can lead to financial instability. Japan, as always, is in a different position. Japan would be vulnerable, of course, to an energy and commodity price spike. But also, I think that the basic trend in Japan is the opposite, which is that inflation is likely to continue to be strong by Japanese standards compared with recent years. And therefore, the issue is about when Governor Ueda at the Bank of Japan will succeed in moving away from the zero interest rate policy. So I think for Japan, the central expectation should be for rising inflation. From an economic point of view, the big question is, does that lead to wage rises, sustainable wage rises? That's what will make me optimistic that something has changed in the Japanese economy when I see wages really rising on a sustainable and strong basis. And at that point, the yen would also recover its value.
Right.
And Japan currently is a cheap country from a British or American point of view as a visitor. A bargain, Japan really is, thanks to the weak yen. I think that 2024 might see that change as the turnaround happens in Japanese interest rates. And perhaps you see wage inflation happening as well. And the strong yen could then be the story of the year from a market's point of view.
Great, thank you. So thank you for the list again. And any final comments for our viewers or anything to add, something we have missed? Could you give us some final comments for our audience of Pivot?
Well, my basic comment is about, has the Japanese economy changed? And I think that one thing has changed, which is that really Japan is developing what we might call a startup culture.
Yes.
A culture of business innovation that obviously PIVOT represents. But also, I think your audience are all part of that startup culture. And I think you can see that in many indicators. Now, that is a long way from changing the basic structure of the Japanese economy, because that will take 10 years, maybe 15 years to really have that fundamental impact on the economy. But the business culture, the startup culture, really does seem to be a very significant change. And so my comment to the audience is, keep it up, ganbatte, get it going, and take some of those risks, because the opportunities are there and the environment is becoming more favorable to you. So I very much will follow your success in that startup culture that is developing in Japan.
Thank you. So I think we have a lot to do for 2024, and I believe it will be a year for Japan to pivot from an old economy to a new business economy. Thank you so much, Bill.
Thank you very much, Takeshita-san. Thank you.
Thank you so much.